"Inca," Diego called softly to his pet dog, but instead of wagging his tail as usual, Inca stared at Diego with an unnormal gaze. It wasn't until Diego was a few feet away that Inca moved. It stood up, its large body tensing, and stood directly between Diego and the entrance to its small cabin. Diego paused, confused. Inca had always been his loyal companion, always greeting him with an enthusiastic tail wag, even in the briefest of absences. But now, its behavior was strange. Its eyes glowed with a strange intensity, sending an unspoken warning. "Don't come any closer." It growled at him, something it had never done before. Diego stiffened, startled by the behavior of his calm and loyal companion. For the first time, Diego hesitated. What was inside the wooden shelter that made his trusted friend act this way? The question lingered as Diego returned to the warmth of his small wooden house, but sleep did not come easily. It was a cold winter night in the Andes, the kind where snow covers everything in a gentle, eerie silence. Diego stepped outside, pulling his thick coat tighter as the wind whipped at his face. His gaze fell on Inca's wooden shelter, which he had carefully built before the first snowfall. But something was wrong. The sturdy dog was not inside where it should have been, nestled away from the bitter cold. Instead, Inca lay on the frozen ground, his eyes locked on the wooden house as if guarding it. When he glanced out of the frosted window later that night, Inca was still there, lying in the snow, his body curled against the cold, but his head facing the shelter. By morning, Diego was determined to understand. After a quick breakfast, he donned his coat and boots, stepped outside, and approached the wooden house again. Inca greeted him with a wag of the tail, but quickly shifted back into his protective stance as Diego moved closer. This time, the dog did something Diego hadn't expected. He grabbed Diego's sleeve between his teeth, not harshly, but firm enough to stop him. Inca pulled him back, his strength leaving no room for resistance. "All right, boy," Diego muttered, raising his hands in surrender. "I get it. You don't want me near the house. But why?" Inca's actions were strange, yet they carried a sense of purpose. It wasn't just instinctive protectiveness. Diego could tell that whatever Inca was guarding inside that shelter was important to him. Later that day, Diego decided on a different approach. He found a vantage point at a distance, far enough to avoid alarming Inca, but close enough to keep watch. Hours passed as he observed the dog's behavior. Inca circled the shelter periodically, sniffing the air and occasionally lying down, but always facing the wooden house. At one point, Diego thought he saw movement behind the small curtain that hung over the entrance, but it was too brief to confirm. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the snow-covered ground. Diego's mind raced with possibilities. Was it an injured animal? A litter of something small and helpless? The idea of Inca taking on the role of protector wasn't surprising. He had always been gentle with the farm's smaller animals, but this level of devotion was unusual. Diego couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was inside the shelter, it wasn't just a simple stray. As the light faded, Diego decided to call it a day. He knew Inca well enough to understand that force wasn't an option. Whatever the dog was guarding, he was committed to keeping it safe, even if it meant defying his trusted companion. Diego stepped back toward the cabin, casting one last glance at Inca before heading inside. The cold breeze swept through the highlands as Diego stood near his wooden cabin, the memory of Inca's unusual behavior still fresh in his mind. Diego could still picture the day he first brought Inca home. The pup had been nothing but a skinny bundle of fur with big, curious eyes. He'd found him abandoned near the edge of a small Andean village during one of his trips to trade firewood. A farmer had waved Diego over, pointing to the trembling creature huddled beneath a wagon. "Take him," the man said, "before the coyotes do." Diego didn't hesitate. Carrying the shivering puppy in his arms, he returned to his humble mountain retreat, vowing to give this helpless creature a chance at life. Those early days had been filled with a mix of challenges and small triumphs. Inca was a quick learner, and his energy brought life to the quiet routine of Diego's solitary existence. Each morning, as Diego set out to chop wood or check his traps, the pup would trot alongside him, sometimes stumbling over rocks or chasing after his own shadow. They had shared so many firsts together: the pup's first snowfall, the first time he barked at a passing fox, and the day he finally learned to trust Diego enough to sleep at his feet. It wasn't long before Inca grew from a scrappy little survivor into a strong, loyal companion. Diego's thoughts turned to a particular day that solidified their bond. It was early winter, and he had ventured out to gather firewood before the storms rolled in. As he climbed a familiar rocky trail, the ground beneath his feet gave way, and he tumbled down a small slope. His fall wasn't far, but the sharp edge of a rock caught his leg, leaving him unable to climb back up. Diego had called out, his voice echoing through the silent valley, but no one was near. That's when Inca appeared at the top of the slope, ears perked and tail stiff. The dog's eyes locked onto Diego's, and without hesitation, he began barking furiously. His barks were sharp and insistent, cutting through the crisp mountain air. Diego remembered watching in awe as Inca refused to leave his side, pacing back and forth, barking until help finally arrived in the form of a passing herder. It had been Inca's determination and loyalty that saved him that day. From then on, Diego knew this wasn't just any dog. Inca was family. Over the years, Diego had witnessed more of Inca's remarkable instincts. He wasn't just a protector of Diego, but also of the vulnerable creatures that wandered onto their land. There had been a time when a tiny bird with a broken wing had landed near the cabin. Inca had approached it with surprising gentleness, sniffing curiously before laying down nearby, as if to stand guard. Another time, Diego had watched as the dog herded a lost lamb back toward the valley, nudging it gently along the way. It wasn't just these acts of kindness that defined Inca. It was the quiet dignity with which he carried himself. Diego often joked that Inca had the soul of a shepherd, always watching over those in need. But now, as Diego stood outside the cabin, with the memory of Inca's recent behavior fresh in his mind, he felt a creeping unease. Something about the dog's refusal to let him approach the wooden shelter wasn't like his usual protective instincts. Inca had always been a loyal guardian, but his actions over the past few days were different. There was a tension in his stance, a silent urgency in the way he placed himself between Diego and the small wooden house. It wasn't anger or aggression. It was something deeper, almost like desperation. Diego couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Inca was guarding, it wasn't just instinct. It was personal. Diego glanced toward the wooden structure, its simple frame illuminated by the last rays of sunlight. His mind raced with possibilities, each one more perplexing than the last. Could it be an injured animal? A predator hiding out of sight? Or was there something he hadn't even considered? The uncertainty gnawed at him, blending with the nagging guilt of wanting to override Inca's silent warnings. Taking a deep breath, Diego made up his mind. Whatever lay inside that cabin, he needed to find out. He couldn't ignore the growing tension between himself and his closest companion, nor could he allow fear or hesitation to cloud his judgment. As the evening shadows deepened, Diego began to form a plan, his resolve firm despite the weight of his doubts. "Inca," he murmured softly, looking toward the dog now sitting near the cabin's entrance, ever vigilant. "I don't know what you're trying to protect, but I'll figure it out." Diego stood by his small kitchen counter, carefully slicing the fresh steak he had brought in from the market that morning. He knew Inca couldn't resist it. The aroma of the seasoned meat filled the room, a familiar scent Diego hoped would distract his loyal but unusually protective dog. For the past few nights, Inca had refused to leave the area around his wooden doghouse, guarding it with an intensity Diego had never seen before. He needed answers, and this plan was his best shot. Carrying the plate of steak, Diego stepped out into the cold air of the Andes. Snow crunched beneath his boots as he approached Inca, who was lying near the doghouse, ears alert and body tense. As soon as Diego got within a few feet, Inca's nose twitched and the dog's head snapped toward him. Diego held the plate out slightly, letting the scent waft toward the dog. Inca's eyes softened momentarily, the temptation clear, but the dog's gaze quickly shifted back to the wooden structure behind him. His loyalty to whatever he was guarding was stronger than the lure of the steak, for now. "Come on, boy," Diego said softly, crouching down and placing the plate on the ground a few steps away from him. Inca took a tentative step forward, his nose working furiously as he assessed the situation. But just as quickly, he stopped and looked over his shoulder at the doghouse, as if weighing the cost of leaving his post. Diego felt a pang of guilt watching his dog's internal struggle. "It's okay," he murmured, "just for a moment." Inca hesitated, but took another step forward. The smell of the steak was too powerful to ignore, and his hunger finally won out. Diego slowly backed away, careful not to make any sudden moves that might alarm his dog. Inca followed, inch by inch, until they reached the door to the kitchen. Diego opened it, and Inca trotted in, his focus now fully on the plate of food in front of him. Diego watched as Inca began to eat, each bite slow and deliberate. The dog was clearly savoring the rare treat. Quietly, Diego stepped back toward the door and closed it gently. He paused for a moment, his hand resting on the knob, a wave of unease washing over him. It felt wrong to trick Inca, his steadfast companion, even if it was for the sake of uncovering the truth. "Sorry, boy," he whispered, almost as if seeking forgiveness. But he had to know what was inside that doghouse. The yard was silent, except for the faint sound of wind rustling through the trees. Diego moved cautiously toward the wooden structure, the snow muffling his steps. For the first time, Inca wasn't there to block his way, to warn him with a low growl or a determined stance. The absence of his dog's usual presence only heightened Diego's nerves. Reaching the doghouse, he crouched low to inspect it. His heart pounded in his chest as he placed his hand on the small wooden door. It felt cold under his touch, the rough texture of the wood grounding him for a brief moment. He hesitated, a part of him wondering if he should turn back. But the curiosity gnawed at him relentlessly. What had Inca been guarding so fiercely? What was so important that even steak couldn't completely distract him? Diego took a deep breath and gently pushed the door open. The interior was dark, and it took a moment for his eyes to adjust. At first, all he could make out was the straw bedding he had placed there months ago. But then he saw movement, a small, subtle shift in the shadows. His breath caught in his throat as he leaned in closer, the realization slowly dawning on him. There, nestled in the straw, were several tiny, shivering forms. Diego's hands trembled slightly as he pulled back. His mind raced, piecing together the puzzle. This was why Inca had been so protective, so unwilling to leave the doghouse. Whatever lay inside, his dog had taken it upon himself to guard it with unwavering determination. Diego felt a mix of awe and relief wash over him. He had trusted Inca all these years, and now it was clear that his trust had been well placed. Nestled in the farthest corner, he spotted a sleek, dark figure. His heart skipped a beat as recognition set in. It was a raccoon. No, not just one. A mother raccoon was curled protectively around 6 tiny kits, all of them huddled together for warmth. Their little bodies rose and fell with the rhythm of sleep, their fur damp from the frost outside. Diego froze, his breath caught somewhere between awe and disbelief. He straightened up slowly, his mind racing. Inca's behavior suddenly made perfect sense. The dog hadn't been acting out of defiance, but out of duty. Diego turned toward the house, where Inca's silhouette was visible through the frosted kitchen window. He whispered to himself, "You gave them your home, didn't you, boy?" A pang of emotion tightened his chest. For all his strength and size, Inca had chosen to protect something so small and vulnerable. The realization sank in. Diego had always thought of Inca as a loyal guardian, but this went deeper. The dog's actions weren't just about instinct, they were about compassion. Inca had seen a need and responded, offering shelter and safety to a family of creatures most people would consider pests. Diego crouched again, watching the mother raccoon shift slightly, her black eyes glinting in the dimness. She wasn't asleep, and she wasn't unaware of him. She knew he was there, but hadn't moved to flee or fight. It struck him as odd. The mother raccoon had trusted Inca enough to stay. Maybe she sensed the dog's protective nature, or perhaps the brutal cold left her with no other choice. Either way, this small act of survival and trust had created an unlikely bond between species. Diego couldn't help but admire the quiet harmony in that moment. A decision formed in his mind. He couldn't force the raccoons out. That much was clear. They wouldn't survive the harsh winter without this shelter. But Inca also needed his space, his sanctuary. Both had their rights to this place, and Diego was determined to find a solution that respected them both. He rose to his feet and walked back to the house. Inca barked again as Diego opened the door, his large paws thudding against the tile floor. "Easy, buddy," Diego said, placing a reassuring hand on the dog's head. "We're not going to kick them out. Don't worry. We'll figure this out together." Diego glanced back toward the doghouse, now just a shadow against the snow. The image of the tiny raccoon kits, curled up in warmth and safety, lingered in his mind. The Andes might be harsh and unforgiving, but in the middle of it all, this small corner of peace had emerged. It wasn't something Diego could ignore, nor something he wanted to disrupt. The raccoons had found a protector in Inca. Now, they'd found one in Diego too. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to create a balance. With that thought, he began planning his next steps. There was work to do. Early one morning, as the frost still clung to the grass and the air was crisp with the promise of winter, he set out with a small axe in hand. The trees near his farm were sparse, but Diego knew how to take only what he needed, leaving the rest undisturbed. He carefully selected sturdy branches, bundled them tightly, and carried them back to his work area near the barn. His hands worked with a steady rhythm, splitting wood, tying it with vines, and shaping it into a simple but functional frame. Next, he gathered armfuls of straw from the barn and wove it tightly around the structure to provide insulation. Bits of dry leaves and moss were added as a final layer to shield the raccoons from the biting wind. As Diego worked, Inca stayed close. The dog had always been protective, but now there was something different in his behavior. He didn't just watch Diego, he moved with him, almost like a partner in the task. When Diego struggled to pull a heavy branch, Inca would instinctively grab the other end with his teeth and help drag it into place. When Diego dropped a tool, Inca quickly retrieved it, his sharp eyes always scanning the area. It was as though Inca understood the importance of what they were building together. By late afternoon, the shelter was nearly complete. Diego stepped back and surveyed his work. The small structure, nestled under a cluster of trees at the edge of the farm, looked sturdy and inviting. It was positioned away from human activity, but close enough for Diego to keep an eye on it. Satisfied, he patted Inca's head. "Good work, boy," he said, with a small smile. Inca wagged his tail and trotted around the new shelter, sniffing it thoroughly, as if giving his final approval. Diego knew he couldn't simply pick up the raccoon family and carry them to their new home. Wild animals, especially a mother with young ones, needed to feel in control of their movements. Any sudden interference could lead to panic, and Diego wanted to avoid that at all costs. Instead, he devised a plan. He carefully laid a trail of straw, leaves, and food scraps from the old wooden kennel to the new shelter. The scent of the fresh materials, combined with small chunks of fruit and nuts he left along the way, would guide the mother raccoon to the new home on her own terms. It was a delicate process. Diego worked silently, each step planned to avoid startling the raccoons. Inca seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. The dog stayed close but never barked or made sudden movements. Together, they laid the trail, finishing just as the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the mountains. That evening, Diego sat on the porch with a cup of coffee in hand, watching the old wooden kennel from a distance. Inca lay at his feet, his ears twitching at every sound. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, just as the moonlight began to illuminate the yard, Diego saw a flicker of movement. The mother raccoon emerged cautiously, sniffing the air. Her young ones, still unsteady on their feet, followed close behind. She moved slowly, pausing to investigate the trail of straw and leaves. Diego held his breath as she nudged one of the fruit pieces with her nose, then picked it up and continued along the path. Step by step, she led her family toward the new shelter. Inca's ears perked up, but he stayed still, his gaze fixed on the raccoons. Finally, the mother raccoon reached the small opening of the new shelter. She sniffed around the entrance, her movements deliberate. Then, with a soft, chittering sound, she disappeared inside, her young ones scurrying in after her. Diego exhaled a sigh of relief. He glanced down at Inca, who was watching the scene intently. "Looks like they've found their new home," Diego murmured. Inca let out a quiet huff, his tail wagging gently. The Andes winter had settled in, wrapping the landscape in a heavy blanket of snow. Life was harsh, yet resilient, and Diego watched from his kitchen window as the mother raccoon cautiously emerged from her new nest. The shelter he had built a few days earlier, hidden by rocks and thick underbrush, was already becoming a safe haven for her and her litter of 6. Every so often, Diego would leave scraps of food nearby, never too close to the nest to avoid scaring her. From a distance, Inca, his loyal dog, stood watch, his muscular frame tense, ready to protect if danger arose. One crisp morning, Diego decided to check on the raccoons. With a small bucket of scraps in hand, he approached the nest slowly, his boots crunching on the hardened snow. As he came within a few feet, the mother raccoon bolted out, her eyes sharp with fear and her body low to the ground. She let out a high-pitched chitter, a warning so piercing that it stopped Diego in his tracks. Before he could react, Inca bounded forward, positioning himself between Diego and the raccoon. The dog stood tall, his ears erect, his tail stiff, exuding calm authority. He let out a short bark, a sound both firm and reassuring, and the raccoon hesitated. Diego stepped back, raising his hand slightly. "Easy now, girl," he said softly, his voice steady. Inca's presence seemed to soothe both sides. The raccoon retreated, her sharp gaze still fixed on Diego. For a moment, the standoff hung in the cold air, but then the raccoon disappeared back into the nest. Inca looked back at Diego, as if to say, "Give her time." Diego nodded, realizing that trust was not something he could rush. It would have to grow naturally, one careful step at a time. Days turned into weeks, and the snow continued to fall relentlessly. The cold seeped into every crack of the small farm, making survival a daily challenge. One night, a storm rolled in, howling through the mountains with icy winds and blinding flurries. Diego knew the raccoons would need more insulation to survive the bitter weather. He stuffed a burlap sack with dry straw and bundled up before heading outside. Inca trotted at his side, his nose buried in the snow, leading the way. The usual path to the raccoon's nest was impassable, buried under waist-high drifts. Diego hesitated, unsure of how to proceed, but Inca didn't stop. With his keen instincts, the dog found an alternate route, winding through a narrow stretch of trees where the snow was thinner. Diego followed, marveling at how effortlessly Inca navigated the terrain. When they reached the nest, Diego worked quickly, spreading the straw near the entrance while keeping his movements calm and deliberate. Inca stood guard the entire time, his eyes scanning the shadows for any signs of danger. Together, they made sure the raccoons would have the warmth they needed to make it through the storm. One night, well past midnight, Diego was jolted awake by Inca's sharp bark. The dog stood at the window, his ears pricked and his body rigid. Diego threw on his coat and grabbed a sturdy stick before following Inca outside. The moonlight reflected off the snow, illuminating the scene. Inca bolted ahead, barking fiercely as he circled the raccoon's nest. Diego's heart raced as he saw what had triggered the alarm, a sleek, shadowy figure creeping toward the nest. It was a fox, its eyes glowing with predatory intent. Inca didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, barking with such force that the fox froze momentarily, startled by the dog's ferocity. The fox attempted to slink away, but Inca chased it several yards down the slope, ensuring it wouldn't return. When Inca finally came back, his chest heaved from exertion, but his posture was proud. Diego knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears. "Good boy," he murmured. The threat was gone, but Diego knew he needed to act fast to reinforce the raccoon's safety. The following morning, Diego gathered wooden planks and wire, crafting a makeshift barrier around the nest. It wasn't much, but it would deter predators from getting too close. Inca watched as Diego worked, occasionally sniffing the ground and marking the perimeter. By the time the sun had fully risen, the nest was fortified, and Diego stood back, hands on his hips, feeling a rare sense of accomplishment. As the winter dragged on, Diego and Inca's routine became second nature. They were the silent guardians of the raccoon family, working in unison to ensure their survival. The raccoons rarely emerged when Diego was around, but he noticed small signs of trust. A soft chitter from the mother raccoon when she saw Inca, the absence of panic when Diego left food nearby. Bit by bit, they were learning to coexist, bound by the shared challenge of enduring the unforgiving winter. Spring had finally arrived on the Andes. The snow that once blanketed the land had melted into streams, feeding the wildflowers that now dotted the mountainside. Diego stepped outside one crisp morning, the air still holding a hint of the winter that had passed. The birds sang in the trees, and the world seemed to hum with new life. Near the edge of his small farm, the raccoon den was quiet now. The once bustling haven for 6 playful kits had served its purpose. One by one, the young raccoons had ventured out into the vast wilderness, their curious noses leading them to explore their newfound independence. Diego stood at a distance, watching the mother raccoon. She lingered near the den, as if reminiscing about the time spent raising her young. Every few days, she returned, sniffing around the entrance and checking for any signs of disturbance. Diego couldn't help but think of it as her way of saying, "Thank you," for the safety, for the peace, for the chance to survive a harsh winter. As the days grew warmer, Inca reclaimed his old space. The sturdy wooden shelter Diego had built for him was now back in use. Inca lay sprawled in the sun outside his beloved house, his ears twitching occasionally at the sounds of the farm. Yet, his watchful eyes never strayed far from the raccoon den. Even as he settled back into his routine, Inca remained the silent guardian, always ready to act if the mother raccoon returned with new challenges. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the Andes, Diego sat on the steps of his farmhouse, watching Inca. The loyal dog stretched lazily, then lifted his head to meet Diego's gaze. It was a look that carried so much, Trust, understanding, and something more profound. Diego smiled and called softly, "You did good, boy." The words felt simple, but they carried a world of meaning. Inca seemed to understand, his tail thumping gently against the wooden planks. The experience of the past few months had left Diego with more than just memories. He thought about how Inca had protected the raccoon family, even from him. There had been something instinctual, something pure about Inca's actions. They reminded Diego of the unspoken bonds that connect all living beings. It wasn't just about survival, it was about compassion, a willingness to share, and an understanding that went beyond words. As spring fully embraced the mountains, Diego noticed how the rhythms of life began to fall back into place. The raccoons had moved on, leaving behind faint tracks in the soil. Inca, ever watchful, patrolled the edges of the farm, his presence a silent reassurance to Diego and the wild creatures that passed by. Diego found himself reflecting often in the quiet moments of dusk, the lessons of empathy and patience lingering in his mind like the warm glow of a setting sun. One particular morning, the first real warmth of spring arrived. Diego stepped outside to see Inca lying in his usual spot, bathed in sunlight. The dog's eyes followed Diego as he walked toward the raccoon den. Though it was now abandoned, Diego couldn't bring himself to dismantle it. Instead, he took a moment to adjust the rocks around it, smoothing the ground as if honoring the memory of its occupants. When he turned back, Inca was there, standing a few feet away, watching quietly. Diego knelt down and rested a hand on Inca's head. "This land's big enough for all of us," he said softly, more to himself than to the dog. Inca leaned into his touch, his warm fur a reminder of the unbreakable bond they shared. Wasn't that just an incredible story? I mean, the bond between Diego and Inca. It's the kind of connection that reminds us of how deep and meaningful our relationships with animals can be. Watching Inca protect that raccoon family, even at the expense of his own comfort, really makes you think about the selflessness animals show us every day. And Diego, he wasn't just a bystander. He stepped up, adapted, and made room for those little creatures in a way that's truly inspiring. Now, what about that mother raccoon? Her courage and determination to find safety for her young. How can you not admire that? It's like nature's way of showing us how to keep going, even when the odds are stacked against us. I'd love to hear your thoughts, stories, or even just what touched you most about this one. Drop a comment below. Let's keep this conversation going. And hey, if you enjoyed this story as much as I did, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more heartwarming tales like this one. See you next time.